Hey everybody, be quiet. Good. Hi, my name's Shane from Rerez, and this is Daniel from Winterion.
Yes,
Oh, you actually got
yeah, no, I've totally fired this up. Shane is the host of Rerez. It's a terrific YouTube channel. If you haven't visited it, do. Positives, negatives,
over there.
worst console series. My name is Daniel Greenberg. I'm a professor of video game history and design at George Mason University down outside Washington, D.C. And I'm also the producer of Ion Gaming on YouTube. So this is
the Sega, we didn't actually say that.
the Sega hardware retrospective.
Yes.
This is going to be essentially a brief overview of primarily first-party hardware that Sega released between their origins in the early 20th century and kind of the last couple systems right at the turn of the 21st. We don't really focus on any third-party stuff. Tectoy is a subject so broad into and of itself that it would require another panel entirely. Additionally, some of the other third-party entries and then some of the software, clone titles, etc., that's kind of all too big for the scope of an hour.
Yeah, this is essentially focusing just on what Sega actually produced, and that's stuff that you'd find anywhere else, like in Brazil and stuff like that, that was done by third-party companies. So, yeah. So, this is the beginning here. I gotta come in to read a little, so I'm sorry, guys, over there, you can't see me. So, as everybody knows, I hope, wow, you know, I'm just gonna stand up.
Dude, by all means.
Hi, because like the TV's so big. So, as many of you know, Sega started up as service games way the heck back when.
So the two main names you need to know are Marty Bromley and David Rosen. Marty Bromley is part of Standard Games, which he starts with his father Irving, who's got some experience in the vending industry. He had started his own vending company after working in the motor business. And they operated out of Hawaii in the 1940s, which, as you can imagine, is one of those moments that kind of catches you off guard. And then sort of the other key name to know here is David Rosen. Now, both Marty Bromley and David Rosen have these military backgrounds, and they're both kind of shaped between their relationships between the U.S. and Japan. So these two guys end up kind of collaborating and coming together, and it's their two independent companies that eventually form Service Games of Japan, or Sega.
Yep. And basically, this is where the company, like the company we know as Sega, really starts to become like a big deal. When they were standard games, service games, there was a lot of coin-op stuff, but nothing like video games and stuff like that.
Right.
It was mostly just like little.
There are kind of two or three major jumps that happen in game history. We go from, true hardware-based games into sort of solid-state electromechanical stuff, and then we migrate from that into microprocessor games. So we'll briefly touch on each of those things, and then we'll spend most of today talking about the consoles. Real quickly, again, Rosen and Bromley end up working together, and by the mid-'60s, Sega Enterprises has been formed, and Rosen takes the role of CEO. So as Shane mentioned, a lot of their early offerings in the 60s and 70s were these solid-state machines, hardware machines. They were known for doing jukeboxes, a lot of slot machines. The Sega, I believe it's the Sega Bell series. There's actually a number of these slot machines. They come in different flavors, different sizes. They made a number of these. The Sega punching bag actually dates back to like the turn of the century. It's just a remake of a popular sort of penny arcade style game. You can think of this as being similar to like the hammer that you have to try to get bell at the top. You pay, I believe it was a nickel to play Sega punching bag. You pull the bag down, and the dial that you can see on the far wall there is actually like measuring the force of your punch.
So technically, Sega invented Punch-Out. So just keep that in mind.
So they continue to make a lot of these throughout the 1960s. Their first major blow-away hit is Periscope. Now, Periscope is actually a Namco product that Sega worked as a licensee for. Now, Sega as a company was responsible for sort of taking a lot of games from America and bringing them to Japan and selling them in Japan. Now, some of that is because in the 1950s, the United States went through a pretty conservative cultural period where a lot of stuff wasn't okay. You may remember Pinball went through some questionable periods about whether or not that was like gambling or legal to play. And a lot of the stuff that Service Games made was no exception. So they were bringing this stuff over, but this is kind of their first big arcade hit.
And I actually think Periscope, if you guys might know this name, very recently, I guess in Chuck E. Cheese's and places like that, they made a new version of Periscope, and it's a ticket redemption machine, I believe.
Okay.
So it's just based off of that, but it's Sega still doing that kind of stuff, so they really like their old stuff quite a bit.
Now, I'm just going to show the next slide, which is a bit of a breakdown from how they sold this machine. But if you can look and see, it's actually very interesting. Periscope came in a single unit or multi-unit, so it had this optional multiplayer thing going. And the entire thing actually kind of works on a bike chain philosophy. The ships go at the far end of this unit, and it's a light gun game, but you have to kind of track and shoot them in the distance. You're playing the role of a sub, and your light gun is actually sort of that typical Periscope sight and fire. You'll see in the first slide, the picture on the right is actually, these are like hand-painted, they almost look like the old model train sets that you would get, where they would do these dioramas and they'd look really nice. So these were all handcrafted. It's like wood boards underneath to make them. So you can imagine these are really heavy boards, and there's a lot of precision and maintenance that goes into this stuff. One of the big kind of hurdles of early gaming is just how expensive this stuff is to make and maintain. Once you've got it originally, ship it out and sell it to somebody, it's good. It's a great business model at first blush. 20, 30 years down the road, these things are impossible to maintain correctly. And then a brief mention of pinball, because pinball, again, could be another topic in and of itself. Sega Pinball is a renowned thing, but it kind of has multiple lifespans. Sega Pinball exists in the 1970s. They produce, I think, roughly 25 or so machines. Many of them are electromechanical. They don't really do too much with the microprocessor pinball machines that are just kind of coming online at that time. But they do end up doing it later because Sega kind of comes into the vacuum. They had the acquisition of Data East, and that gave them a pinball space to work with, so they released another set of machines in the mid to late 90s. And then at the end of the day, they end up flipping these assets to Stern's, I believe it's his son. So the old Stern pinball from many, many years ago is defunct. His kid decides to kind of pick up their family legacy and start this thing up again. So he gets the assets from Sega and fires up Stern Pinball. So Stern, who's now sort of the major player in pinball, and a lot of the new machines that are coming out are through them, and even some of the big names that used to make machines in the past now, some of those big name designers now work for sort of the renewed Stern, which is really just Sega's old assets.
Yeah, and I guess around this area you probably know Jersey Jack Pinball, and they're a really big company. Not massively big, but they started doing Wizard of Oz, I think, and a couple of other ones. Hobbit, I believe, and all that is influenced from a lot of the stuff that Sega was doing during the 90s, and I believe Gottlieb and a couple of other companies were doing stuff. Sega's pinball machines from this era during the 90s are really, really cool. If you guys can, there's an image of it right there. GoldenEye 007 is a fantastic pinball machine with a lot of really cool features and pieces. And I believe X-Files is another one they made at the time too. And that X-Files has a really cool file cabinet that you can actually get the ball to go into the file cabinet. It lowers and up, heightens up and everything. It's an amazing table, and at that time Sega was doing a lot of really cool stuff. Unfortunately, they didn't continue with it because pinball died, but It was cool for when it lasted.
Yeah, and there's still an enthusiast group out there. It just doesn't really include Sega, so for purposes of the lecture, we're going to jump ahead. So there's a big migration to microprocessors, and this is for a lot of people. It's for the pinball industry, it's for consoles, it's for arcades. Sega buys US-based Gremlin Industries in '79. And the acquisition of Gremlin gives Sega an in the microprocessor game market. They can start to make games that we would think of as typical video games, things that aren't working on transistor logic, but are instead typical programmed games on chips, on ROM boards. The first machines they make in coordination with Gremlin are the VIC Dual machines. Now the VIC Dual machines are unique in that they are the early usage of the Zilog Z80. This is a chip you're going to hear about throughout a lot of Sega's lifespan. This microprocessor drives a lot of their early hardware from the first machines they're making. I believe it actually survives all the way through the Genesis era.
I think so, yep.
But you'll notice the board on the left has sort of the main board, and you can see a bit of an elevated Sega board with there. That is sort of the game board sitting on top of the service board, and that's also a pattern that even to this day, Sega arcade machines, some of the newer ones like the Naomi machines and stuff beyond that, use this idea of you can plug and play a game on an architecture because the architecture meets a certain system spec. In this case, VIC Dual. Atari was famous for doing this with like the System 1 and System 2 games. Sega just kind of followed suit. The Nintendo Play Choice 10, same idea. It's like ROM boards pluggable into a system. Carnival pictured here is kind of just an example of these early Gremlin Sega games. I believe that looks like, it may look sort of like a ColecoVision level graphics there, but that's kind of, or maybe a ZX Spectrum even. Same idea, it's that 8-color.
Actually, you know, if you want to play a couple of the Naomi boards, I believe there's actually a couple just out there in the arcade right now.
Yes, I've seen at least one. They kind of look like these generic machines, but behind the hardware in there is actually like a ramped up Dreamcast. And the hardware in there can also have like these big plug-and-play boards that almost look like video cards. You can just kind of take one out, plug another one in, good to run a different game. So now the same sort of hardware stuff, and especially the Z80, is what migrates into Sega's first foray into the console market. The SG-1000, I mentioned the Zilog Z80 processor. The other two, the TI processors, are your video and audio drivers. These three chips, these two Texas Instrument chips and the one Zilog Z80, these are sort of the backbone for Sega's early gaming. The audio, the video, and the processor kind of stay consistent throughout. These are coincidentally, I think they're almost exactly, if not exactly, the same chips that are in like a ColecoVision. I know at least it's a Z80, if not a Z80 clone. The problem is this system came out in 1983 in Japan, when the Nintendo Famicom came out. So as you can imagine, basically what was a clone of Coleco coming out the same year that the Famicom came out, they're kind of operating at a bit of a disadvantage. The advantage they've got is it's pretty easy to make stuff for the system. They didn't have some of the early hurdles that Nintendo had in the first couple years of their launch. The SG-1000 actually ends up having a fairly decent showing in Japan. It makes no real waves outside of it. But the system gives them enough of a footing that the company realizes that this is like going forward, that they can make this their business. Pictured along there is an SG-3000, which is basically a 1000 with a keyboard built in because, for those of you familiar with the programming language BASIC, a lot of the logic on here was driven by BASIC. You actually plug in a BASIC cartridge and program on the system, make your own games if you wanted to. Additionally, printers, because early consoles at times also functioned as like home banking solutions for people. So they would do...
especially in Japan.
Yes, yeah. Way more so than anywhere else really. The keyboard attachment, the 3.5 floppy attachment, and then for those of you old enough to know, cassette tapes were actually used as discs in days of yore. Do you want to do the Mark III?
So this is the Sega Master System. This is the Mark III. Now this is the one that we got the. You can see in the bottom there, the black one. That's the one we got in North America, and that's the one most people are familiar with. In Japan, it looks like that at the top.
Yep.
And I believe that also has a secondary card slot on that one as well.
Yeah, and then I've also thrown over on the side there the FM synth board.
There you go.
That you can get separately.
Yeah, the Sega Master System is like a wonderful system, and this is the one that was really put onto the market to kind of compete against the NES. Like this is after the NES happened, or Famicom.
Right.
They wanted to release something that could compete directly against Nintendo in North America. Didn't work. I think everyone here probably bought an NES at some point or another. Yeah, that didn't happen so much with the Sega Master System. There are fans here, but this was just the first try. And I believe at the time, the CEO they hired for Sega America couldn't make this work. So they ended up firing him and replacing him with, I forget his name. Something. Sega Genesis was with him.
Kalinske?
Tom
Kalinske?
Tom Kalinske. So I think, no, maybe it was with Sega Genesis they used it.
I think Kalinske comes in at that point, but
Kalinske comes a little bit later. But anyway, the Sega Master System is a wonderful system. I believe the actual bottom one there has a hidden video game on it. It's, I think, just Worms? Not Worms.
Snail Maze.
Thank you.
So, yeah, if you turn the system on without a game, it had a default ROM sitting in it to execute. Some of the key things to know about the Master System. It does not do terribly well in North America. It actually has a fairly decent showing in Europe, and it kind of holds its own everywhere else. This is also a system that becomes beloved in South America.
Yeah, Brazil, big time in Brazil. Like to the point where I think they're still making games for it in Brazil.
Yes, they're still making Master System clones in Brazil with like gorgeous shells and everything. So that did really well there. Again, note that it's still using the same Zilog Z80 processor, which means if you had programmed for the previous one, you knew how to program for this one. There's some consistency there. You're using the same assembly language to do it. There's a slight increase in the palette. There is native RGB support on the system. It's got mono sound, but it did, though we didn't get it, the Sega Mark III had, the little box on the left is actually an FM synth chip. That's an expansion, and it's a Yamaha synth chip. And that's really key because going forward to the next system, the combination of the Master System hardware and that FM sound chip is kind of what's responsible for the Genesis music that everyone knows and loves. Which actually brings us to the precursor to the Genesis. When I mentioned the VIC Dual was sort of one of those early arcade boards that they had, Sega System 16, they had made a few other board iterations throughout this process, but the System 16 is a big one. It kind of proves, it's a proof of concept for all these 16-bit games that they've been working on. Stuff like Altered Beast, Golden Axe, a lot of those early Genesis titles are ports of System 16 arcade games. Now, you'll note that there are two chips this time that are driving this. You have the Z80, but you also have the Motorola 68000. That is the faster 16-bit chip that's kind of doing the heavy lifting here, and the Zilog Z80 actually operates as a co-processor. The great news here is that you have the Yamaha chip with a Zilog coprocessor, which is kind of laying the groundwork for what the Genesis can do musically, plus you have the ability to do these 16-bit games. Now, contrary to popular belief, most people say the whole blast processing marketing thing that Sega used during the Genesis days was because of the faster clock speed of the Motorola. That's part of it, but really what it is how quick they can get the video buffer to move on the bus for that architecture means that like the right side of the screen as it's moving can get the next line over and stacked in quicker because it can write to the video buffer so quickly. So for those of you who remember playing games on like the NES, like Mario 3, where if you're like halfway from like one pixel to another, like the far side of the screen would have the original pixel that was there but like off color because the video buffer was trying to cycle stuff and they had to use some sort of hardware tricks to do it. Sega laughed at that. Like that was the VRAM buffer writing for this System 16 was so good that they had this beautiful fast scrolling, and that really sets the stage for like their fast platformers and kind of everything else that comes from there in the Genesis era.
Yep, and that gives Sega like a distinct feel when you're in the arcade too, and that's why a lot of the older arcade games were things they wanted to port over to other systems, which probably comes into the next slide, I think.
Yeah, and again, mentioning Kolinsky, this goes big time into like their marketing because their system can do this really fast video shift. That becomes a major marketing tool. It's like, oh, look how slow and turtley Nintendo is. Like, we have the speedy games, which, of course, this system brings to the market. You know, this is their flagship console. Now, the Genesis has the same stuff the System 16 does. It's got the Zilog Z80 and it's got the Motorola 68000. But in addition, you'll notice that it has both the Yamaha chip that was available as like an accessory chip for the Mark III, and it's got the old Texas Instruments sound chip. And it so happens that they found out they could simultaneously do FM synth and you get a lot of those channels going, and then use the noise and like PCM channels from the old Texas Instruments, which is why you get that really nice like drum and bass percussive element to a lot of the Genesis's music, is they had these two sound chips, really the old Master System chips and the Genesis chips, kind of simpatico working together to get these, you know, very heavy channel sound stuff. In the same way the Super Nintendo had like 8 sampled channels and thus could do like orchestral stuff really well if you spent the time to make really good sound banks. The Genesis had more sound channels available, more PCMs, and could do the FM synth and like the noise waves at the same time, and that's why you got that really great percussive sound that came out of it.
It's a great way to example of the differences between the two sounds. It's like think of the way that Super Mario World sounds, and then think of the way that X-Men sounds on Sega Genesis. Like X-Men sounds rougher, more distinct, and it's got like it sounds like a rock and roll song. That's something you probably weren't going to get on the Super Nintendo because the Super Nintendo was good at doing a lot of things, but this sound chip combination has a very different, more I'd say like electric sound to it almost. Yeah,
and that's because again it can do both the synth and the sampling work. Now, it did have, because it had the Zilog Z80 and it had the old Texas Instruments chips, The Genesis was backward compatible with the Master System, and they used that in marketing to their advantage, like at the time. There are still videos on YouTube of like parents complaining in 1991, like, I don't want to buy the Super Nintendo for my kid because I can't play the Nintendo games on it. Now, to be fair to Nintendo, there were not many like Americans being like, my huge Master System library is just sitting on the shelf, because no, there were very few people for whom that was a true statement. But it was still a really good selling point, and Kalinsky, being the great marketer he was, like, yeah, they made sure that was out there in the media. Like, in the first couple of years, it took a while for Nintendo to get their footing with that 16-bit console.
Yeah.
We're kind of going chronologically here. Staying on the arcade stuff briefly, the Play Choice 10 I mentioned earlier, the Nintendo system that allowed you to put in different cartridges and play them based on what was in there, Sega did a few years after Nintendo did, I think 3 years after, because I think 86 was Play Choice 10, so 89 would have been the Mega Jet system. Now this is really biting hard because it has the same UI-based screen on the top part of the machine. It has the same concept with plugging in cartridges into the system board inside the arcade. The original Mega Jet games allow you to play, but you buy time. So it doesn't matter how good you are at the game, you're throwing quarters in for extra minutes of the game, but if you die in the game and you still have time, you can always reboot it, go through the main menu, start up again. So it was a real low-tech solution here. They weren't modifying the game code, they were really just time restricting you. They do end up going back to this later with the Mega Play, where they decide to actually modify the games to let you put quarters in for lives and stuff. I do not think there's a Mega Jet out there. I scoured a bit.
Yeah, the interesting thing with a Mega Jet is if you had an arcade game that was out there that somebody really sucked at, they could put in a lot of quarters just to stay around. But with this system only could generate a certain amount of money per day based upon the fact that there was only so much time given with the quarters inputted. So if you actually put the math together, there's like a certain max cap of how much you'd make. And other arcade machines didn't have that. Somebody could walk in and die in Donkey Kong in 2 seconds, and then they have to put in more quarters. And
right.
that's one of the disadvantages of the Mega Jet system that I think a lot of people never really acknowledged before.
And it's just no surprise it was not a terribly big thing for them. It didn't really go places.
But if you find one, it's pretty expensive now. So,
yes.
A
lot of these rare things are fun to get. So we mentioned home banking. In 1990, the Genesis does get the Mega Modem. This was designed primarily, I think it's only released in Japan. Yeah. But this is done for programs like Mega Answer. This is done for banking specifically. It actually had some add-on hardware you could get, which included but wasn't limited to like a remote control, a touchpad, like a numpad for punching in your personal accounting. It had lots of options for doing some banking stuff, but none of this stuff really makes it overseas, and they never really leveraged the modem in the Sega Mega Drive / Genesis. They never really leverage it for games. They do later. This isn't the hardware they used to do it. Game Gear. So this is the first time I think they used one of their planetary code words for a system, because Game Gear was technically Project Mercury. The Game Gear is, for all intents and purposes, a portable master system. It's got the same setup. They've upped it from mono to stereo sound. It has a smaller resolution because the screen is bitty, and this thing loves AA batteries.
Oh yeah. It takes 6 AA batteries to run this thing, and it was intense. When I was a kid, I went to Ireland, and I actually had a Sega Game Gear. I had it at home. My mom refused to allow me to bring it on the plane because you're going to break it, and we have to buy another one and find batteries, so she was upset with that. So when I went there, I'd never seen a Sega Master System before because they just didn't really have them around here. So we went to my mom's friend's house. I got to meet with her friend's son, and he's like, "This is my Master System, or this is my Master System. This is what the game I play, or the system's on." And I was like, "I have these games portably," and he was like, "No, you don't. That doesn't exist. That's science fiction." And yeah, I never really could explain. I mean, now he's probably older and doesn't care, but
Sure.
Back then it was a big deal. And the TV tuner was such an amazing thing to have, because for me and for many kids, that was the cheapest, smallest TV. Because many, like at the time, the 90s, you really didn't have too many TVs in your household. So to have your own TV that was yours, that you could watch underneath your bed covers when your mom didn't know, so you could watch, you know, all 7 channels.
I was going to say, like 4, 5, 7, 9 in the PBS station you could get on the UHF's side.
Well, where I lived, you had to take a really long aerial just to get PBS. But, you know, it was a big deal. This system here is such an interesting idea. And to have a full color screen was a huge deal. Backlit color screen at that. Because Game Boy was not even close to that. But obviously more people bought the Game Boy because, you know, not so many batteries. But
so if you had the chance to go to the My Life in Gaming panel earlier today, Mark and Corey are great at identifying the best ways to get the highest quality picture out of stuff. The TV tuner for the Game Gear has an audio video in. You can actually take modern stuff and inject it into that tiny screen. If you really wanted to play the latest Call of Duty on a Game Gear, you can do it. Now you need your separate controller, and you're going to be squinting at it, and it's going to look like a mess. But if you want the single worst color TV picture you can possibly get for your modern game consoles, this will do it. Although it'll also run out of batteries pretty quick. So
yeah. Can't go get it. Oh, so a nice thing, too, is if you have a Sega Genesis Model 2, you can actually just use the Model 2 AC adapter on a Game Gear, and it works cross. Yeah. And it was great. Like, it was a nice thing to have. But, you know, not like not something a lot of kids would have done. And
you're typically not dragging that into the car, so.
Yeah.
So now we start to get into the attachings period.
Or we like to call this the failure of Sega.
Aww.
So, well, this is when it starts to get into problems.
From a hardware perspective, the Sega CD adds an additional 68,000 processor on there, so it can do some additional side stuff, so you can actually start to do some passovers for different processes. There's a custom GPU that Sega had commissioned. Beware anytime you hear about like custom video architecture being made for games, because it immediately means that there's a learning curve for the developers trying to do things on said consoles. This was kind of their introduction to 3D polygonal graphics. It does double the sound channels from 10 to 20. Not a ton of developers take advantage of that, but the Sega CD does actually have a pretty robust audio underpinning. And it does, because it's a CD system, enable 16-bit sound, 44.1, sort of what you would expect from a CD player in the 90s. Combine the 32X in there, and those two can actually interoperate to play Sega 32X CD games.
Yeah, like Fahrenheit and stuff like that.
Corpse Killer. Yeah. There's only like 5 or 6 of them, but they do exist.
And believe me, if you're going to play any of those games and you have the option, you should try it that way, because it does make a big difference. With Corpse Killer, the actual screen on the regular Sega CD version is much smaller and cropped in the center, but when you use 32X, it's actually full screen. Well, not full screen anymore, because now we have widescreen televisions, but at the time it was full screen.
Full 4:3.
Yeah, and it was a big deal, like to actually be able to see that game in such high quality. Now, big deal, I say that now. Back in the day, nobody cared too much because you had to have a 32X and a Sega CD and a Sega Genesis. So to convince parents at the time was, hey, you know that game your kid really wants? Buy 3 systems to play it. And yeah, it didn't work.
No, this did not really take off. Some fun things to know about the Sega CD. It has its own internal memory. It didn't use memory cards, but it did use memory cartridges. You could buy a cartridge that would go into the Genesis slot. To function as your memory card, and you really needed to do it if you needed to save anything, because the onboard memory for the Sega CD held 1, maybe 2 games.
Yeah.
It was miserably small. Thankfully, there wasn't exactly a large RPG library for the Sega CD, so it wasn't a big deal necessarily, but it really didn't have it. You had to go get a separate thing. I think Stone Age Gamer, who's out there now, is actually making higher quality Sega CD memory card Genesis cartridges, so free plug for them, I guess.
Oh, yeah. Something about the system I think that is very important. I consider this the Three Stooges effect. Not the 3 systems. The 3 AC adapters you needed to plug up to the wall because they were big. And for most people, like right now, if we wanted to actually plug this up here, we couldn't because we'd power down the building. This took so much effort to find all the right holes in the wall, actually get it in the right spot. To this day, when I actually want to play this setup, and I have that exact same setup at home, I have to get a strip and then plug everything up individually, and I have to always turn the last one because they just ramp into each other.
Now you'll notice there's two different form factors here. The first one was the Model 1, and this was made for the Model 1 Genesis, so it's sized to that. The Model 2 takes the Sega CD unit and kind of sets it to the side, and is sized for a Genesis 2. However, they did make a little plastic extension you could stick on the side, and you could put a Genesis 1 plus that little plastic end to kind of keep it flush onto the Model 2 Sega CD.
And like for collecting purposes, if anybody's looking for that, the Model 1 version with the actual drive that comes out, that one's worth a lot more, but it's more prone to breaking because there's a lot more mechanics going into it. If you're looking to just find a Sega CD just to play and have fun with, probably look for the Model 2 because it has a better durability just because they didn't have a disc tray in it and stuff like that.
And it's easier to repair to boot, so.
Yep.
So now computers.
I love this one.
So there are a few third-party computers, but I'm sticking with this one because it's largely a first-party machine. The Sega Teradrive is basically a 286 computer with a built-in Genesis port that you can play Genesis games on your 286. You'll notice that it has 3 processors now. We've got the 286, we've got the Motorola 68000, we've got the Zilog Z80. It does do 640, 480 display for the PC side, but the resolution goes back down to the 320, 224, whatever, the Genesis resolution. It jumps down to that when you're actually playing the Mega Drive games. It did have an optional hard drive for those of you who actually wanted to save anything you ever did. It has an option to extend RAM like most systems at the time did. And then it actually does have Microsoft DOS on there, so this is among the earliest cooperations between Microsoft and Sega, which would be seen again years later with the Dreamcast. But this does have a Microsoft DOS kind of back end with a custom UI over it for playing these games.
It's a really cool system, and honestly, for many people, with the way that this computer would work, having the ability to just put the cartridge right in front, start playing games, was really cool. And in England, there's like a lot of video games, or a lot of like computers out there that were sold like video game consoles for kids. So it's not that weird over there, but here it's not a common thing. You know, PCs here were generally made by American companies. Over there, they could do a bunch of different things and try and sell a bunch of different processors, operating systems, and a billion things to a billion different people.
One of those European computer companies, Amstrad, actually made their own version of this called the Mega PC. The Mega PC is this gorgeous, like true 90s, like cream shell computer that is basically a beefed up version of the Teradrive. And if you can find it, the classiest way to play your Genesis games is with the Amstrad Mega PC, like ivory colored Genesis controller. But they do interoperate, so they look really cool. It's one of those fun finds. I'm gonna actually go dig around the vendor area, see if I can pick one out later. The Amstrad Mega PC went for the equivalent of $2,400 today. So if you wanted a computer that could play PS4 games and you were willing to shell out $2,400, that's roughly what they were getting back in '93. And speaking of '93, maybe the most underrated Sega console of all time,
the Sega Pico. Now, Sega Pico is fantastic because it is, I'm going to say this, it doesn't suck. It should. In every way, this shouldn't work. But this thing is very accurate, plays games incredibly well, but it's basically you buy storybooks that have video game cartridges in them. You put them down, and there's a little pen on the bottom right you can see there, and the pen knows exactly on the screen where you're hitting things. It's like an early version of a touchscreen almost. And you just can't believe how accurate this is, because it shouldn't be. I'm going to call them magicians at this point, because the wizards over at Sega managed to get this to work, and get it to work so well on cheap, crappy hardware that should not have been able to do the things it does. There are really good games on this platform that you simply don't hear about. Now, this bombed in North America, but in Japan, they kept going with it.
They had over 300 games in the library all told by the time they were done for the Pico.
Yeah. And some of the games are made for kids, but then they started to go to more adult, a couple of them, not a lot, but there are some really strange games on there. I believe there is a Pokemon game on there as well.
Yeah. So the 6 to 10 age range is super successful with the Pico in Japan. Hardware-wise, it's basically a stripped-down Genesis. They take out the Zilog Z80, they take out the Yamaha, so they're running on like the Texas Instruments sound stuff, and then like the 68000 does a lot of the heavy lifting. It is really for a kid's toy. This thing's really durable. It's built in a strong clamshell. It's sort of like a laptop. This thing is all those really weird like tablet games you're downloading to distract your kids before that was a thing and before that hardware was available. And for what it was, this actually worked really well. The yellow sort of book/cartridge you see in there, the way that Pico operated is the top part was largely empty. You plugged in what was essentially the combination of a cartridge and a book, and it was capable of using the pen and the buttons in there to touch and censor and interact with this book because it was simultaneously like a book and a cartridge.
Yes. And I mean, what really blows my mind about this, now I assume you guys have seen like VTech stuff for kids, you know, like all those throwaway video game systems. Okay, this looks like a VTech system. It's not. It should have been, right? And I think that's one of the reasons why it did so poorly, because on store shelves at the time, there was a lot of VTech stuff, a lot of throwaway systems, and if they weren't the things people knew, like the Sega Genesis or the Super Nintendo or anything like that, then they simply weren't going to pick it up. And right here is a great example of something that Sega was doing that was totally advanced, like the Sega CD or the 32X, but it just wasn't like just pushed out the right way.
It deserved better. I think we agree, yeah. So on to 1994. We mentioned the Sega Modem didn't really get used for online gaming. This did. So Sega made a cooperative move with cable providers to start streaming games into your home via the Sega channel. So the way this device worked is you plugged it in just like a cartridge. It had a coaxial port on the back. You would go through your cable line, and you would have roughly about 50 games per month, and they would cycle different games in their library month to month. I believe in these days, in this area, it would have been Adelphia Communications. And Adelphia did have Sega Channel support because I've got family over in Ocean County who had this. But it was neat. You could play these different games, try them out. They would tell you, like, month to month, this is changing. But it was essentially Netflix for Genesis games.
Yeah, pretty much. That's essentially what it is. I believe they also had, there's one exclusive game on here, and I believe that's Mega Man Wily Wars. So I believe that was originally released for Sega Channel.
It came out on disc cartridge later, though, yeah?
No, it never did.
Oh, it was only a repro?
Only repros.
Okay.
But it was released originally for the Sega Channel, and that was as far as I'm aware, the only time Mega Man ever got released on the Sega Genesis. And it's kind of it's like a 1-point upgrade almost to the original Mega Man's. Graphics are a little bit better in certain instances and stuff. We've got Mega Man right there. Can you confirm this? Yes?
I can confirm, but I was pretty sure, I thought it was released in cartridge form in Europe, actually.
Probably in Europe then, but not in North America.
And it's neat. Yeah. It's a remix, essentially. Like, they do some fun things with it. If you are a Mega Man purist and like, oh, they changed this thing or maybe a little bit. But no, it's definitely worth a try.
Yeah, and Sega Channel is just, it was really interesting at this time, but once again, way too ahead of the curve.
I think there are people in the emulation scene who are trying to recreate this as an online service. I'm not sure if they've succeeded in doing that yet, but just making it so that you could run the Sega Channel ROM locally and it would emulate like the transmission over the cable line using like your Ethernet connection and like simulate being online and then just dump different ROMs in. So
or download an emulator, you know, whatever works.
Sure.
Whatever you used to do today, you know.
If you want to go the truly convoluted route, right? So jumping back to our Franken system just real quickly, the 32X part doesn't actually come out until 94, so it's a few years after the Sega CD. This is another one of those ones that had a planetary code name. This was Project Mars. It had two 32-bit processors that would, these same two chips, basically upgraded versions that get used later in the Sega Saturn. So the hardware inside the 32X is almost like a trial run for the stuff that ends up going in the Sega Saturn. It has its own custom GPU again. It has two additional pulse channels that it's added. So now we've gone from 10 audio channels to 20 audio channels to, in the full system, the 32X CD, I believe 22 audio channels available. I'd be shocked if any of the 6 games that actually supported this whole thing touched half of those.
There's no way. See, a beautiful thing about the Sega CD is that most people were making one-track audio, and they were mixing everything into that one track. So you didn't need that many channels once you had a Sega CD, because you could just put all that really complex orchestral score stuff on one single audio track.
Right.
So the more lines they added, we don't really need that. With the 32X, you're right, 6 games. I don't think anyone used them.
This also supports early, I think it used Q sound for its architecture. So before we got into like modern surround sounds, there were companies like Dolby in Q-Sound who were doing proprietary surround sound solutions. And if you had the correct hardware for those things, the 32X did give you Q-Sound surround. Again, I don't know how many games actually supported that.
I believe Snatcher used it.
Sounds right.
Maybe.
Sonic CD then as well.
Sonic CD,
Okay.
yeah.
But it was available if you were interested in Q-Sound. Like, that was a thing you could actually do early surround at this point. The CDX is basically, and I did see one of these on the show floor. I did see one of these guys hanging out there. This is basically just a Genesis and a Sega CD in a little tiny form factor, nice and portable. It did have an LCD readout on the front because this thing could also double as everybody's favorite 90s contraption, the portable CD player, of which everybody just about had one.
Only the coolest kids had a Sega CDX.
Right. And promptly lost it because somebody saw it. And was like, yeah, I'm walking away with that.
It didn't have shock skip, right? Like, so when you knocked it,
Yeah.
you gotta reset the song sometimes. Like, it was a bit of a stupid thing. But hey, you know, it existed because somebody needed that, I guess.
If you needed desk space, but really wanted to have a Sega CD, which desk space, this is a great solution.
And I believe not compatible with the 32X.
Correct.
Yeah.
The airplane system, the Sega Mega Jet.
Did you ever want a Sega Genesis that was portable but didn't have a screen on it? Mega Jet. This was a weird one. So this was something that they made originally to have on airplanes, so that when people were sitting down, they had the screen in front of them, they could actually play games on the go, which was a really neat idea, and I believe they did sell them in Japan to consumers.
Yes. Yeah. So this is what you're looking at there is actually the consumer model, and they did. The consumer model had 3 releases, I think. The Alpine was like the fanciest of them. It uses corded power and corded video out, so you have the system and you're holding the system and playing it, but you got to link it up to some sort of display and some sort of power, and my goodness. This thing, interestingly enough, if nothing else, is the precursor to the Sega Nomad.
Sega Nomad, Sega Game Gear Plus 2. So this is where it gets really weird. This system, how long's the battery life on it? Did he come to this door now?
Yeah.
Wow.
The battery
hours.
life for this guy is roughly 2 panels here.
Yeah. So what's hilarious is the Sega Nomad battery life is roughly the same amount of battery life as the Nintendo Switch. So that's funny. You'd think they would have improved it over 1995, but hey.
No, 'cause I think the Game Gear and the Nomad, if you take it apart, has a big CFL bulb that has a voltage step up.
Nice.
It drains a ton of power.
Sure.
Oh yeah, because they didn't have the same backlighting technologies we have now. They simply didn't have at the time.
It's just a mirror with a CFL. There's a mirror behind the CFL.
Yeah, the fluorescent bulb's just going to drink the battery out, right? So,
Now, my friend Norm, the gaming historian, swears by the D-pad on here. He loves it.
okay.
I don't understand him in the slightest, but he says he loves this thing. And there's people out there that do love it. They say the way you control games with this is a lot better. Unfortunately, you probably can't see on the screen too much. I can't see what you guys are seeing exactly.
They're seeing what we're seeing.
Yeah, so you've got the 6 buttons in there. Now that's important because some people that got Sega Genesis only got 3-button controllers, and there's a couple games out there that actually use the 6-button variants. So with this, when it's portable, you at least have all 6 buttons, so you can run all those games. Had this been released a little bit earlier, it would have only had 3 buttons, and then
Right.
it would have been kind of bad.
But again, if you're going to play it, AC adapter.
Yes.
So now the third last system, there's a secret one at the end. The Sega Saturn. Again, this has the chips that came out of the 32X. It's got a larger palette, 4 channels. You start to see now some of the transforms, rotation stuff, the stuff that the Super Nintendo made awesome with the Mode 7 architecture they were working on. This is where you start to see that really get fully integrated here in one organized pattern. They have 2 video chips, and this is sort of like the early SLI pattern where one chip's responsible for some things and one's another. The VDU1 chip does all the foreground and sprite stuff. The VDU chip does all the background and transforms, but they work in concert to do all the video rendering.
The Sega Saturn is really good at 2D graphics. Now, if I were to compare the PlayStation, which is about the same era, to the Saturn, I would definitely say that the Saturn runs circles around the PlayStation's ability to do 2D rendered assets. That's why you don't see... There are a lot of 3D Sega Saturn games, but predominantly the 2D stuff you can find on this console is amazing. It's just a lot of really good stuff.
And unfortunately, it came out in 94, 95 when 3D games were all of the rage. So as you can imagine, as the PlayStation picked up steam, this guy really struggled.
Yeah. And this was also, what hurt this was they did a surprise release of the system, I think a month before its actual release.
Yes, they did jump the gun on this.
Yeah. So what they did was they were like, you know what? Everyone's excited. Let's release it a month early, but not tell anyone. So nobody bought it, because what happens when you don't tell anybody that got released a month early? I think they announced it at E3, but at this point in time,
E3 is just out of the CES shadow. It's not really a big thing.
Yeah, there's 10 people in the audience, you know, like they know you can buy it right now, and they're like, cool, and then they walked away. And I think another thing that really hurt Sega Saturn at that time was when they introduced the price of the Sega Saturn. It was directly after I think it was Sony came on stage to announce their price, and they cut the price down.
Yeah, they got undercut by PlayStation on the same announcement stage.
Because at this point, Sony is this massive company, and they own all the production companies that make all this stuff. So they were just like, well, you can say $5, we'll do $4. You know, like they didn't care, and that really hurt them a big time.
Since we're short on time, I'm going to jump past the Sega Pri Fun. Feel free to ask me about this after the show if you're curious. This is basically a thermal dye sublimation printer that can take still images from your games and print them out in paper form.
It's pretty fun.
The Sega Dreamcast, I'm going to real quickly mention, this is, of course, everyone thinks of this as the last Sega system, and it mostly is. It is a combination Windows with their own personal user interface. This had the famous Windows Compact Edition, or CE, as its back end. This is sort of the first system we credit with having online gaming because it has the built-in modem, and then it's also got broadband support. It has the keyboard, the mouse. There's a lot to like about the Dreamcast, and there are many great retrospectives that have been done on just this system, sort of like perfect storm of wrong time, wrong place, the 99.99 marketing and everything that happened, it kind of undercut them, and this was it for them. This was their last hurrah.
And unlike many systems that basically ended with a slowdown and a ramp down in production because they sold so many, the Dreamcast literally died on top. So even the last games that were being released on this console were still really good. So it's unfortunate. You see consoles die and fade away. The Dreamcast died at its peak.
Yeah.
And that's what really changed. That's why the system is so revered to this day.
And then if you want to impress people and like surprise them when the Dreamcast is not the last system Sega released, it did have a karaoke system. Lots of them had karaoke. And we mentioned Naomi before, which is basically Dreamcast architecture in the arcade. But the Beena, 2005, our beloved Pico gets a revival. The Beena is Japan exclusive. It has some of the 32-bit architecture that was in the Dreamcast, the same way that the Pico is a stripped-down version of the Genesis. The Beena is a stripped-down version of the Dreamcast. And it is an up-to-date, modern version of the Pico. It didn't have quite the success of the Pico because this is the mid-2000s and we have things to do this with now. But as you can imagine, it was nice to see they ended with what I think we both agree should have gotten a lot better run.
Yeah.
With that, what was going to be a Q&A session will have to be a Q&A session outside because we have hit our time limit. Again, Shane, thank you so much for
Thank you for having me.
doing this. And thank you all for being here.